In the softly glowing light of a high-end restaurant, lively laughter mingled with the gentle melody of background music. Mark Keller leaned casually against the bar, a glass of red wine in hand, his eyes quietly scanning the room. On a small stage at the front, the manager had just lifted a microphone to toast the couple of the evening, their 8th wedding anniversary. "Let's all raise our glasses to the perfect couple, Mark and Julia Keller." Julia, radiant in a sleek red silk dress, stepped forward, linking her arm through Mark's. Her gaze swept across the familiar faces of friends and colleagues, her smile as flawless as the night seemed to be. But Mark didn't smile. He tilted his head slightly, whispering through barely parted lips, "You seem more interested in your texting than enjoying the party." Julia froze for a split second, her eyes darting briefly to his before she quickly composed herself with a faint smile. "It's just Mum checking in," she replied, her voice sweet but tinged with haste. Mark raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. She turned and walked toward the restroom, her phone buzzing faintly in her hand. As the restroom door closed behind Julia, Mark cast another glance around the room. His gaze stopped on a man sitting a few tables away, a man with neatly groomed hair, a perfectly tailored suit, and a self-assured half-smile that didn't waver as his eyes followed the door Julia had just entered. Mark exhaled slowly, the corners of his mouth twitching into a faint smile of his own, one devoid of warmth or humour. He knew exactly who the man was and why he was here. Without wasting a moment, Mark set his wineglass down and moved discreetly to a secluded corner of the bar, where he had left his phone running a monitoring app. On the screen, a text message had just appeared from Julia's phone. "Sorry to keep you waiting. Just a few more minutes, I promise." Mark closed his eyes for a brief moment. A wave of unfamiliar anger rose in his chest, but he suppressed it. He wasn't impulsive, and he wasn't about to lose his composure. No, Mark was someone who knew the value of patience, and whatever awaited Julia behind that bathroom door, it wouldn't be what she expected. The party continued around him, filled with laughter and cheer. But Mark was no longer the loving husband standing by his wife's side. He was a man waiting for everything to crumble, as calm and calculating as a wolf savouring the final moments before pouncing on its prey. Back home in his study in Boston, Mark sat alone under the dim light of a desk lamp. The phone on the table lay silent, but his mind was anything but quiet. Memories of the past flickered through his thoughts like a worn film reel, each scene a reminder of a marriage that had once sparkled but now bore deep, irreparable cracks. He thought of the first time he met Julia on their college campus. She had stood beneath the shade of a sprawling tree, a book in her hand, her smile as bright as the sunlight filtering through the leaves. Julia had been unlike anyone Mark had ever known, graceful, sharp-witted, and passionately curious about literature. He had fallen for her instantly, not for her beauty alone, but for the way she made the world around him feel alive. What lingered most in his memory was the way Julia used to look at him. Her gaze had a way of making him feel like he was the centre of her universe. It was as if, no matter how chaotic the outside world was, everything would be fine as long as she was by his side. But something had changed. Perhaps it began when Mark became consumed by his career. Architecture wasn't just a job for him, it was an obsession. The long hours, endless business trips, and late nights returning home to find Julia already asleep. It all took its toll. Julia never complained, but Mark could see the loneliness in her. Their conversations grew shorter, their embraces more distant, and the intimacy that had once been the cornerstone of their marriage began to fade. Yet Julia wasn't the only one who felt the void. Mark had made a mistake once on a business trip to Chicago. A long day, a charming young colleague, a few too many glasses of wine. It had spiraled out of control. He never told Julia about it. He convinced himself it was a one-time lapse, not worth tearing down everything they had built. But what Mark didn't realize then was that this single moment of betrayal had left an invisible fracture in their marriage. It wasn't the act itself that did the damage, but the silence that followed. Julia never confronted him, but she wasn't naive. Someone as perceptive as her must have sensed something. She didn't ask questions, but her eyes changed. The trust that once radiated in her gaze was replaced by hesitation and distance. Slowly, Julia began to seek comfort elsewhere, in friends, in books, and eventually, in Liam. Mark didn't want to admit that he was the catalyst for Julia's transformation, but he couldn't deny the truth. He knew that his betrayal, whether Julia was fully aware of it or not, had created the space for her loneliness to grow, a void that Liam later filled, and knowing that left him caught in a tangled web of guilt and anger. He stared at the desk, his hands clenched into fists. The betrayal wasn't just hers, it was theirs. And yet, despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him, Mark's resolve hardened. Whatever guilt he felt would not deter him from what needed to be done. Julia had made her choices, and now it was his turn to make his. In the quiet room, Mark reached for the glass of wine on his desk but didn't take a sip. His gaze fixed on the phone in front of him, where Julia's text to Liam still glowed on the screen. "I need you, Liam. Only you understand me." Mark closed his eyes, his fingers tightening around the glass until his knuckles turned white. "Only you." Mark let out a short, cold laugh that echoed in the stillness of the room. He set the glass back on the desk, stood up, and stared at his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him wasn't the one Julia had once loved. He didn't know exactly when he had changed, but one thing was clear. Julia no longer belonged to him. Maybe she hadn't belonged to him for a very long time. But if she thought she could walk away without consequence, she was gravely mistaken. "This game, Julia," he murmured to himself, his voice as sharp as the edges of his thoughts, "has only just begun." Julia sat at a small cafe tucked into a quiet street corner, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the large glass windows, painting the room in golden hues. The latte in front of her had gone cold, but she didn't notice. Her eyes were locked on the man sitting across from her, Liam Hawkins. He was the kind of man Julia had only read about in novels, sleek, with jet black hair, a charmingly roguish smile, and a confidence that seemed to radiate from his every movement. Julia smiled faintly as Liam recounted a humorous work anecdote, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop wondering how things had come to this. How had she ended up here, in a meeting heavy with the scent of guilt, while Mark was likely at home, trusting that she was meeting colleagues for a work project? But Julia couldn't stop herself. Liam was a gust of fresh air, a stark contrast to the stagnant suffocation she had felt in her marriage for years. Liam didn't just flirt, he listened. He looked at her as if she were the only thing that mattered in that moment. He wasn't Mark, and for Julia, that made him irresistible. Their first encounter had been at an educational conference. Julia was there to present a lecture, and Liam, as the event's main sponsor, had been an enthusiastic audience member. After her talk, he had approached her with effortless charm, engaging her in conversation about her presentation. He praised her sharp insights and offered his perspective with an ease that felt both natural and intoxicating. His words were as smooth as expensive wine, and Julia, unable to resist, found a rare satisfaction in being truly noticed, or at least feeling like she was. That meeting was just the beginning. Their initial emails, exchanged under the guise of professional collaboration, soon turned into playful banter and eventually deeply personal conversations. Liam shared stories of his failed marriage, how he had once loved but lost it all. Julia found an odd sense of connection in his words. She didn't tell him that she, too, felt her marriage teetering on the edge of a cliff. She didn't need to. Liam seemed to understand it in the way he looked at her. Today's meeting at the cafe was their first true rendezvous outside of professional settings. Julia had tried to resist. She had wrestled with herself for days, questioning if she could avoid stepping into a trap she knew she wouldn't escape. But that morning, when she stared into the mirror and saw her own tired face and vacant eyes staring back, she realized she no longer had the strength to fight. She craved the vitality that Liam brought into her life, even if it came at the cost of everything else. "What are you thinking about?" Liam's voice jolted her back to the present. Julia blinked, her cheeks flushing faintly. "Nothing," she murmured. "Just a long day." Liam leaned forward, his gaze intense and unwavering. "I think you need a day where you don't have to think at all. A day just for yourself." Julia met his eyes, and for a moment it felt like she was being pulled into them. She knew this was wrong, but the longing to feel free, to feel seen, overpowered her reason. She couldn't stop herself from thinking that if this was a mistake, at least it was a mistake that made her feel alive. Liam smiled slightly, as if reading her thoughts. "Don't worry, Julia. I won't disappoint you." Julia returned his smile weakly, but her heart was pounding. It wasn't fear of being caught. It was excitement. She had gone too far to turn back now, and she wasn't even sure she wanted to. In the darkness of his study, Mark sat before his laptop, the bluish light casting sharp shadows across his face. On the screen were videos he had taken over the past few weeks, clips of Julia and Liam holding hands, their eyes locked in intimate glances, their smiles filled with secrets Mark hadn't seen in years. In one clip, Julia leaned against Liam by the bar of a luxury hotel, her laugh ringing out as it once had when they were younger, when she had loved him. Mark stared at the screen, his hands gripping the edge of the desk so tightly his knuckles were bone white. His face, however, betrayed no emotion. It was calm, almost unnervingly so. "All right, Julia," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. "You wanted to play a game? Then let's play." "All right, Julia," Mark murmured. "You want to play? Then I'll play with you. But this will be your final move." For 3 painstaking days, Mark had meticulously crafted his plan for revenge. This wasn't the impulsive outburst of an enraged husband. This was the calculated work of an architect, someone who knew how to design everything, even the perfect downfall of his enemy. The plan began with an anonymous email sent to Liam's office. Attached were intimate photos of Liam and Julia, accompanied by a simple note. "I think your boss's fiancé would be very interested in seeing these." Liam was a notorious playboy, but he had carefully curated an image of professionalism and respectability among his colleagues and business partners. Mark knew this would be the first devastating blow. Liam would be thrown into a whirlwind of gossip and judgment, forced to fight to protect the reputation he prided himself on. But Mark didn't stop there. He hired a private investigator to dig deeper into Liam's life, and what he uncovered only added fuel to the fire. Liam wasn't just a philanderer. He was also deeply in debt and had a history of conning wealthy women to fund his lavish lifestyle. Mark decided this information would be the match to ignite the destruction of everything Liam had built. As for Julia, Mark had a separate plan. He didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he pretended everything was fine, acting as though their marriage was as intact as ever. He spent his days quietly documenting her every move, each secret text, each late-night outing, every lie. Mark wanted enough evidence not only to ruin her reputation, but to ensure she had no way to retaliate when the truth came to light. The night before he put his plan into motion, Mark sat alone in the living room, a glass of wine in hand. Julia hadn't come home yet. She'd texted to say she was meeting friends, but Mark knew exactly where she was. Through the hidden camera he'd installed in her car, he could hear her laughing with Liam as they drove to yet another luxury hotel in the city. He no longer felt pain or anger. Those emotions had been replaced by a chilling calm. When Julia finally returned home, Mark was sitting in his armchair, leisurely flipping through the pages of a book. He glanced up as she walked in and smiled faintly, but there was something in his eyes that made Julia pause. "You're late," he said, his voice low and gentle, as it always was. Julia forced a smile, hurrying past him to avoid his gaze, but Mark wasn't finished. "I have a surprise for you," he continued, and she froze mid-step. "We're going away this weekend. I think it's time we rekindle things." Julia turned to face him, hesitation flickering in her eyes, but she eventually nodded. She couldn't say no, not when Mark's words carried an unexpected warmth that made her feel a pang of guilt. What she didn't realize was that this weekend was the first move in Mark's final game. That weekend, Mark drove Julia to a secluded mountain retreat. The place was breathtaking, surrounded by dense forests and overlooking a crystal-clear lake. Julia, captivated by the beauty of their surroundings, didn't suspect that this was the stage Mark had chosen to bring everything to an end. He watched her as she sat by the lake, lost in thought, her face serene. For a brief moment, he felt a twinge of regret, but it quickly faded as he remembered her lies, her fake smiles, and the night she spent with Liam. That evening, under the dim glow of candlelight, Mark placed a thick folder on the table in front of Julia. "I want you to look at this," he said evenly. Julia opened it, and her face went pale. Inside were photos, messages, and even videos of her and Liam at various hotels. "Mark," she stammered, her voice trembling. But he cut her off, his gaze as sharp as a blade. "No need to explain. I already know everything. This isn't for me to hear your excuses. It's for you to understand that this game is over." Julia began to cry, but Mark remained unmoved. He stood, looking at her one last time before walking away, leaving her alone with the weight of her betrayal. The game was truly over, and Mark, a man who had once believed he had lost everything, was now moving forward, leaving behind a life that had crumbled. Mark drove away from the retreat, his car gliding silently along the shadowed road, leaving Julia behind in the ruins of her despair. In his hand was a small USB drive containing all the evidence he had gathered over the weeks, proof of her infidelity, of her hidden life with Liam. The headlights illuminated his face, revealing a calm expression tinged with profound sorrow. He no longer felt anger or heartbreak. Those emotions had been eroded by time and truth. Instead, he felt an empty stillness within, as if a part of him had died with the marriage he once cherished. When Mark returned home, the house that had once been their sanctuary now felt like an empty shell. The wedding photos that used to hang on the walls were gone, the shared belongings carefully packed away into boxes and pushed into corners, out of sight and out of mind. Mark didn't look back, nor did he hesitate. He spent the entire night completing his final tasks, transferring all the funds from their joint accounts into his personal one, cancelling every credit card tied to Julia's name, and sending an email to his lawyer to prepare for an uncompromising divorce. The following morning, before the sun had even risen, Mark stepped out of the house for the last time. On the kitchen table he left a single note, brief and final. "It's over. Handle your life on your own." There was no explanation, no goodbye. He loaded his luggage into the car, started the engine, and drove away toward the horizon, to a future waiting somewhere far from everything he had left behind. Meanwhile, Julia returned home later that day, stepping into the cold and barren space that had once been filled with warmth and memories. She called out Mark's name, but only the echo of her own voice answered her. Then she spotted the note on the kitchen table. Reading it, her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming uncontrollably down her face. Julia had nothing left to hold on to. Liam, her lover, had disappeared as soon as Mark's meticulously timed revelations destroyed his professional reputation. She was left with nothing but shame and the suffocating weight of loneliness. Weeks later, Mark had settled into a small town in Colorado, where he'd taken on a new job with an old friend. His new home sat atop a quiet hill overlooking a lush green valley. It wasn't large or extravagant, but it was enough to give him peace. Every morning, Mark would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the distant mountains. Sometimes his thoughts drifted to Julia, but the memories no longer pained him. They were fragments of a past life, a life he had left behind and didn't plan to revisit. One afternoon, while wandering through the town's modest market, Mark crossed paths with Elena. She approached with her familiar smile, though her eyes carried a trace of concern. "Are you okay?" Elena asked softly. Mark nodded, offering her a small, genuine smile, perhaps the first in a long time. "I'm okay. Thank you for everything." They found a quiet cafe nearby and sat together, their conversation easy and unhurried, like two old friends reconnecting after a long separation. Eleanor didn't ask about Julia, and Mark didn't bring her up. Instead, they talked about simple things: work, life, and the possibilities of what lay ahead. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink, Mark glanced at Eleanor. He realized that she was one of the few people who had stood by him during his darkest days. Perhaps, he thought, life wasn't entirely unfair. Perhaps sometimes destruction was the foundation for something new. Mark smiled again, this time with a quiet but profound sincerity. He knew the road ahead was long, and there were still parts of himself that needed mending. But at least now, he was ready to move forward, with lightness in his steps and hope in his heart.